I'm Benjamin Miss, and this is Introduction to Psychology Disorders. What's interesting about this section is when students take Introduction to Psychology, this is usually what they expect it to be, right? We've seen that psychology is huge. It's a huge area of study, so many different interesting topics. But this is kind of like that, pre-expectation, the Freudian kind of what's wrong with us, what do we label these things as and deal with them. So we're looking at when it comes to disorders, the definition really is these actions, thoughts, and feelings that are distressing or harmful. And it's not an easy thing to say what is abnormal, right? Because we're looking at, all right, what's harmful? What's distressing to you? What's distressing to you might not be what's distressing to me or to somebody else. Well, we kind of leave this up to the counseling psychologists, psychiatrists, clinical people, and they use the term abnormal way more than we would, right? And so they would actually define that nearly a fifth of all persons in the US over any 12-month period would have some kind of action, thought, or feeling that's distressing or harmful enough to be considered abnormal. Now, this is a very large number of people. And when you think about it, the value of therapy, the value of treatment, the value of dealing with things is really quite high. And certainly, you probably know people who are kind of against this. And there's a lot of reasons why people, have issues with it. So we look at what is abnormal, and kind of how we deal with these things. We say, okay, many people worry. How much does a person have to worry for this to be abnormal? People are shy. When do you have some disorder related to shyness? And there's a lot of issues with this, right? So I think that it's best to look at what we consider the continuity explanation for mental illness, which is this. Worry is on a continuum. Some people worry a lot, some people worry very little. Most people worry kind of a typical amount, right? It's only when you get away from the mean, right, on your normal distribution where it becomes problematic and it becomes like people worrying so much they can't function, they can't decide, they can't act, right? Shyness is only an issue if you're feeling like, hey, it's getting in the way of some kind of functioning that I'd like to have. But people can adapt to their lives. I think a lot of the issue with kind of how we feel about ourselves comes very much from the bombardment of media and social media. People looking at perfect lives, perfect expectations, rather than saying, this is who I am, what's comfortable for me, right? It's said it's like the societal expectation on behavior. And when we look at it, it doesn't match up with kind of our development. So these two ideas are, continuity and discontinuity. And most disorders really would fall into this. People are sad. When is it depression? People are excited. When is it mania? That kind of thing. Just like sometimes you tune out. When is it depersonalization, or dissociation? But then you have disorders like schizophrenia that may actually kind of like jump to a new thing, right, and be discontinuous and not be like typical functioning. Well, we also know that there's a great deal of bias and things too. Like you may know people who are who literally say things like, "Oh, it's all in your head." Well, yes, everything's in our heads. It doesn't mean it's not real. Mental illness is a little judged more harshly because we can't see it. Somebody who has a major physical injury, we can see it. But you hear stories about how judgmental people are when they can't see clearly that somebody has some kind of deficit or some kind of challenge. And it's just kind of like, well, why don't you just, think your way out of it, which is just nonsense. Denying depression, denying mental illness is like denying that the sun is in the sky. Like it is that observable, it is that testable and measurable. Well, historical views start with supernatural theories. And if you look at things like, exorcisms, right? That was a way of dealing with this. There's a lot of like shamanistic rituals worldwide that have dealt with mental illness, things like possession. Later, when the scientific community, the medical community first got into it, they looked at biological theories, and these go back too. And then more modern theories are the psychological, right? And we'll kind of go into that's where we're at. So, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, supernatural theories haven't gone away, and this is really quite fascinating because they generally represent a failure in reasoning. Now, here's the thing, right? As scientists, we never say something is not possible. There's always some realm of possibility. What we say is show the evidence, right? If you could show, somebody floating, you know what I mean, above the ground, or predicting the future, like empirically, yeah, we're gonna believe that, right? The problem is these things haven't been shown. And there was this article in the Washington Post, where a psychiatrist argued for the diagnosis of demonic possession, and basically everybody writing in was like, "Are you mad? Why?" You know what I mean? And the problem was, I think they published it because they knew it'd be controversial and get attention. But it does show that people do this, and just because someone has a medical degree doesn't mean they understand how to think critically. And there's a great, rebuttal, and this is from Steve Novella's neurological blog, on demonic possession, where you look at, okay, what is actually happening here, and the logic is the problem, right? My subject's behavior exceeded what I could explain by my training. Well, just because you can't explain something doesn't mean it's not real, right? Paranormal, right? But again, that's filling in the blanks. If it's paranormal, measure it. And then they kind of get into, these other things, right? So like, okay, she could tell some people's secret weaknesses, such as undue pride, and know some other things. But we can find out a lot about people. And there's something called cold reading, which is really, really quite fascinating, right? And cold reading is the idea that we can, kind of see how people are. It's called the P.T. Barnum effect too, right? And this is really, really quite interesting. So it's kind of like, saying to somebody, you have a secret sin. Well, everybody's got something, So it's like, you have money concerns. Okay, almost everybody does. Or, one of my favorites, like, you probably have a relationship where you feel like you put in a lot more effort than the other person, and that makes you uncomfortable. Okay, so these are the idea of, we can, in a room full of people, a cold reading, a psychic will go in with this way of kind of getting to people, and then just listening to people talk, and they give things away, and then they'll say, oh, the psychic knew that. Well, you told them in a lot of cases. It's really, really interesting. And this is all from Steve Novella's analysis of this, which is just a really nice way of looking at the issue with, why would a psychiatrist believe in supernatural theories? And the answer being, well, we need to look. Is there evidence, or can all of these things be clearly, errors in thinking? Speaking languages, like speaking Latin. Everybody knows some Latin phrases, caveat emptor, buyer beware, e pluribus unum. Okay, so that's not terribly surprising. Exhibiting strength or levitation, these are all friend of a friend. And they always say, well, you can't videotape these things, but here's the thing, like, this is confidentiality. I'll say this right now, and I think that most people would. If I ever exhibit demonic possession and I'm levitating, film it, put it on the internet. You know what I mean? That's wild. Here is some clear evidence that is paranormal and outside the realm of scientific explanation. And with video today, it's the same thing, where with all the video and cameras today, why don't we have any better pictures of aliens, of flying saucers? It requires this leap of imagination, and often is lack of critical thinking. So again, we're not dismissing the concept of exorcism. In fact, we know from the placebo effect that if you believe in it, it's going to help you. In cultures that believe in these things, these kinds of treatments can actually offer relief to people. We're not even saying that it's impossible for demonic possession to happen, but we're saying is, let's see the empirical evidence. And a lot of these kinds of analyses are kind of depressing because it's like, okay, you're showing a clear failure in logic, a clear failure in rational thinking. We really would expect more. But we see this everywhere. There's always going to be somebody with a degree disagreeing with the vast majority of the field, and the media is going to glom onto that person and be like, oh, see, whatever the point they're trying to make. Well, when we look at our modern views, right, we're talking about things like, inherited predispositions, abnormal functioning of the nervous system and the brain, stress, abnormal social learning histories, inadequate social support. Remember, we talked about personality. We talked about the body fluids, basically, right? The different 4 kind of mixes of black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, right? That led to these 4 personality characteristics. Going back thousands of years in terms of, looking for a biological explanation. But here we're looking at what is actually involved in abnormal behavior. And we see, social support is a big, big deal, with resilience, with children, with no matter how bad the child's environment is, having a stable, supportive adult is just a massive, massive protector against, issues and a predictor of resilience. Many of you have heard of the concept of insanity. Insanity is not a psychological term. Psychologists don't use the word insanity unless we're saying like, whoa, did you see the trick that person did on that skateboard? That was insane. Insanity has nothing to do with the mental well-being, right? So legal concept about, is somebody competent to stand trial? Can you involuntarily commit them because they're not showing competence? And it usually has to do with, legally, the ability to know the difference between what we would consider right and wrong. Someone behaving in a way that is, outside the realm of this, and that's why there's been historical, less prosecution for crimes of passion versus crimes that are like planned out, right? Where you may not be aware. So back to the problem of stigma. People feeling labeled, people feeling afraid can make these things worse. And back to those, the continuity view. Look, if people are going to avoid seeking help because they feel like things are an extreme, that's definitely not good. We know that, people have many, many concerns, mental illness issues, and absolutely deserve to have treatment and support, rather than people saying, no, your feelings are just your feelings, who cares, ignore them. Feelings are our reality. Whether right or wrong, they're our reality and deserve respect and care. Well, as we get into it, just remember there's this term called comorbidity, which basically means you can have 2 disorders at the same time. And here we see examples of clinical depression and anxiety. Very common to have these things be comorbid, right? Meaning just because you have depression doesn't mean you can't be anxious, right? Or vice versa. And when we look at the mental illness, one of the things we're looking at is what's called the diathesis stress model. And diathesis is the kind of genetic predisposition, and stress is the environment. And this is a image that's very quite common, this type of graph, which is looking at the risk of developing schizophrenia. Why do some people develop it and some people don't? Why do, if you have an identical twin, you're identical. Why do only half of, if one twin develops it, why does only half of the other twins develop it, right? Instead of, complete. And you look at the relationship, we see this kind of thing with intelligence. Just because there's the genetic link doesn't mean there's other factors involved. And so that's the idea when it comes to, um, how these things work. Now, we go into the disorders themselves, right? And we consider starting with anxiety, right? Well, it is clear that children today report more anxiety than child psychiatric patients in the 1950s. And this has been kind of discussed in an article called The Age of Anxiety. And anxiety levels have continued to rise. Are we in an anxious age? Well, the pressures on us are high. Media has reached this point of there's always something to be terrified of. There's always something happening that's going to, be the end of us or something. So there's a lot of reasons for it. And, over, our recent history with COVID and how everybody's dealing with things, certainly there's a lot of concerns and a lot of things to worry about. Well, anxiety is considered to be excessive and unrealistic to make it a disorder, right? So, again, we all worry, but anxiety is the tension and apprehension. It's natural, right? A little anxiety is good evaluation. Anxiety improves our performance. A disorder, however, are excessive and out of proportion responses to the triggers, right? So, having extra work or an extra assignment, and okay, here's a trigger. What do you do? Okay, I got a little work to do. Well, this is, oh my God, end of the world. I can't handle this, right? So when is it? How are we responding to these things? And there's a bunch of different types of anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders are like this kind of like, class of things, and one common one is called phobias. Many people have various types of phobias, right? Are you afraid of things like spiders or flying or crowds, closed spaces, germs? These are things that we're familiar with, right? You have social phobias, right? This is that evaluation anxiety, which is typical, but is it heightened for people? A common one you've heard is called agoraphobia, which is fear of open or public places. Escape would be difficult. You might feel as if you're trapped. We also have another major one, obsessive compulsive disorder. Most people are familiar with this. And it's interesting because we know that certain things like falling in love mimics some of these symptoms, right? Can't stop thinking about the person, talking to them, obsessing about. So we understand this mechanism, but in this case, it's unwelcome thoughts, persistent and unwelcome thoughts, and compulsions to carry out some act that is unreasonable. The idea of continually washing hands, the idea of checking the door locks multiple times, right? This anxiety that's related to, something building up, and the compulsion temporarily relieves it for people, but not necessarily in a permanent relief. It's like a temporary thing, and it's almost like this reinforced type thing. An extreme one is called hoarding, right? This is an extreme anxiety disorder. Most people who are hoarders have suffered trauma, and for them, getting rid of things can be traumatic. So they have beliefs like, if I keep the things, I'll be safe. And the fact is, I haven't been robbed since I started hoarding. So a person might have been robbed. Their home was broken into. They felt violated. They then decided that, well, I'm just going to not throw things away. I need more things. I need more things. And keeping things is keeping me safe. And oh, look, I haven't been robbed since I've been keeping things. So every time they're not robbed, it reinforces this belief that if they don't throw things away, they'll be safe. So it's a self-reinforcing belief, extremely difficult to treat. Avoidance conditioning is the idea that every time you avoid something, it reconditions the avoidance of that thing, right? It's highly resistant to extinction. You have to, treatment involves trying to get people to throw away things a little at a time. And hoarding is incredibly, incredibly difficult to treat. Really, really tough. Another anxiety disorder is panic disorder, intense panic with physical symptoms, where out of the blue, you're just kind of doing your thing, and all of a sudden your heart is pounding, you're breathing hard, and you feel this overwhelming sense of anxiety. Um, it's kind of like if you're on a treadmill or you're exercising, you're sweating, your heart's pounding, and you're breathing hard, right? But if those symptoms were to come up out of nowhere, it is this experience of panic, right? And it kind of self-feeds in because it's like, what's wrong? Something's wrong. I feel like something's wrong. Something must be wrong. And it kind of, it self-increases those panics. We have what's called generalized anxiety disorder, which is intense anxiety for at least 6 months. So a lot of people might experience this. It's not connected to anything. They're just anxious, right? This ongoing experience of anxiety. And one of the more common ones that we're seeing now is called post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, we often associate it with military, people who fought in a war, been somewhere where there's fighting, and you're in a heightened state of anxiety. So you're already anxious, right? Because like there's literally people who want to kill you, or perhaps you live in a dangerous environment, dangerous neighborhood, and there's dangerous situations there all the time. And then what happens is something traumatic does happen, and it creates this immediate rewiring between your amygdala and hippocampus. And then things that are related to this traumatic experience will reignite this trauma, right? That's the classic example of somebody comes back from a war and fireworks send them into this PTSD state, right? Where they're kind of like, extremely high anxiety and afraid, right? So these things can traditionally were called shell shock. The trench conditions of World War I apparently were so like rife for PTSD that many soldiers came back from the war, and they were just untreated. There was an American general in World War II who literally struck soldiers in a hospital because he didn't think they had anything wrong with them, but they were suffering from what was then shell shock and became known as PTSD, a very real and very severe anxiety disorder. When we look at causes, we consider a number of things kind of all working together, right? There are absolutely biological predispositions. For instance, people have predispositions based on the functioning of their frontal lobes, amygdala, and hippocampus, and we can predict this. And this has actually been used militarily to look at, okay, who's likely to have PTSD? Can you, put people in dangerous situations who are less likely to develop long-term stress disorders from them, right? And kind of see, who is and who isn't likely to develop these things. Well, the idea of the psychoanalytic explanation is these are unacceptable impulses that threaten to overwhelm the ego. The behavioral is classical conditioning, learning, and we see for something like PTSD, we absolutely see, almost like a behavioral mechanism here. We see this with hoarding, right, increasing. Cognitive, which is the maladaptive thought patterns and beliefs, and then the biological, genetic related and clear effects in the brain. So anxiety is composed of subjective, emotional, cognitive, psychological, and behavioral components. And we look at what this is. And we look at things like, how anxiety and depression affect us in society. We often think of them as individual issues, but they have major economic costs, billions of dollars a year. And the major cost is not treatment. It's lack of productivity, lack of economic participation, right? Or lowering of productivity and participation among people. Well, depression is more common in women than men, but suicides tend to be higher in men. Men are much more likely to commit suicide. There's also ethnic differences and some historical differences. They've looked at, how religion can have an effect on people's likelihood of committing suicide. We see, for instance, when it comes to depression, There are some very clear predictors and demographic differences. And you look at this and you say, well, what are the factors here, right? The idea of create a model to explain this data. How can you describe this? Basically creating a theory. Well, rates of depression are highest in 45 to 64. So these are people who are not at retirement age, kind of in the middle adulthood, and so what would these influences be? You got 10, 20 years of work, maybe things aren't going well, right? People with less education tended to be higher rates of depression. People who are either divorced or widowed tend to have higher rates. Those who are unemployed are more likely to have depression. Women and minorities tend to have higher depression, and those without health insurance, which is going to be related to income, poverty. And so you see these things of what's related to this, right? What is related to depression? And it seems that those with fewer economic opportunities, who are unhappy in their situations, are more likely to experience this. But there's also clearly, we know this biological and these predispositions. So we're looking at all these kinds of predictors, and it tells us how can we do better as a society in terms of helping. With anxiety and the demographics, we see that women are more likely to experience anxiety. And in this case, minorities are less likely to experience anxiety. And this is interesting because it suggests that, again, societal expectations can be related to both depression and anxiety and affecting people in different ways based on those things. When we look at how things are affecting the brain, we can clearly see that there is a link between the brain and certain disorders. So here, for instance, we see the prefrontal cortex associated with body dysmorphic disorder, the orbitofrontal cortex, which is related to OCD, the anterior cingulate cortex, which is related to hoarding. And so orbitofrontal would be kind of right around here, and then on the bottom here, and then you would see this is the anterior cingulate with hoarding. We also know that this can be used, some OCD issues in here too. So you can see where these things are affecting. When you look at treatment and neurotransmitters, we consider the effects of these things. So for instance, when you look at, the treatment, a lot of the modern treatments of the medications affect the synapse and affect, for instance, the availability of serotonin and other types of neurotransmitters. This isn't necessarily the cause of depression, right? So, but it is kind of because drugs affect the synapse in a certain way and people feel better often after taking these drugs, these are then believed to be related to what is the cause of depression, right? But in all likelihood, it's a number of situations that involve networks in the brain, connectivity in the brain, as well as these things. And we'll look into modern treatments in our next segment. Well, predictors of depression include the role of genes in the environment, again, the diathesis stress model. And when you look at this, this shows us a gene that has to do with serotonin. And people who have the long copy of this gene are more likely to have no depression, no matter the childhood issues. However, when you look at childhood maltreatment, basically child abuse, those who have this are more likely to have depression if they have the short copies of this gene. So you can predict to a certain extent genetically the link between the environment and depression. So we look at kind of some of these ways of dealing with these things. And if we go back and look at the neurotransmitters, you can do all sorts of different things to make neurotransmitters more available. Now, the next set of disorders are called somatoform disorders, and these are body illnesses with no known medical cause. Now, sometimes lazy physicians will be like, oh, it's a somatoform disorder, just because they can't figure out what the solution is. And oftentimes there may be some underlying physiological cause. So somatoform disorders are specifically, there is no underlying physical cause. Hypochondriasis is a mild somatoform. I know, comparably mild somatoform disorder, but people who suffer from this might not feel it's mild. But for people with this condition, they always feel like something's wrong, like they're sick, like there's some kind of, major issue with their well-being. They're obsessed with health, with avoiding germs. They might be like, oh, it's lung cancer, or tuberculosis, like, little cough, and it's a big issue. I'm sure that over the course of, COVID, people were extremely influenced by this. We look at other somatoform disorders, including conversion disorder, the idea of actually having a major physical impairment in the absence of any physical cause. People who suddenly are deaf or mute or can't move a body part. The case of Bertha Pappenheim, we talked about, who that Freud was aware of, influenced his understanding of these things. It was like there were these clearly major somatoform disorders with her, and there was no obvious cause. A pain disorder is related to this, right? Someone's feeling pain, but there's no physical cause for it, which you can imagine how difficult it is to treat pain. Again, there often may be physical causes for pain, and somatoform is specifically a psychiatric cause. Now we get to dissociative disorders. So here we start with depersonalization. This is when the person kind of starts to become distorted or unreal. They feel as if they're not real. Some extreme versions of this might be that someone believes that they're no longer alive. Cotard syndrome. They believe that they're a walking corpse. People, you may have distortions in their surroundings. Things don't appear real. And even something like this can be considered part of the continuity hypothesis in terms of, you ever tune out? You just kind of go off into your own little world. You're not really connecting to things. Other things include dissociative amnesia, where someone might have memory loss completely caused by, psychological causes, right? They can't remember things. Jason Bourne from The Bourne Identity is a good example here, because he had trauma, but he didn't have anything wrong with it didn't appear that he had anything wrong with his brain or any of his abilities or his critical thinking. He just couldn't remember his life. And this is extremely rare, right? There's very, very unlikely that brain damage of any any area could cause an amnesia that's related to, who you are. You see like a dissociative fugue state, right? Where the individual cannot remember who they are, or information about their previous life. They just can't remember anything. These people might just kind of take off and go on a trip because their life feels so unreal. Now we get to our mood disorders, and we're going to talk about two major mood disorders, which are major depression and bipolar disorder. And so this image kind of works in both ways. You're looking at mood over time. And when you look at the green line here, we see that the average person has moods go up and down. Sometimes your mood is elevated, sometimes it's down. Again, with the continuity model, someone who has depression has an extreme drop in mood. And then someone with bipolar is going to have this extreme drop, as well as these extreme peaks that rise to the level of what we call mania or hypomania, right? So major depression involves sleep disruption. It can be increased or decreased sleeping, appetite changes, low interest in sex, low or excessive energy over the course. So a person could have like low energy at some points, and other times they have like excessive energy that's like really undirected. They don't know what to do with it. Difficulty concentrating or making decisions, and often suicidal thoughts. This is a very serious issue and absolutely needs support. Now you consider bipolar contains these characteristics of major depression, and other times contains things like extreme mania. And mania looks a lot kind of like extreme use of certain drugs, intense euphoria, racing thoughts, little need for sleep, psychotic distortions, buying sprees, sexual promiscuity, dangerous type behaviors, gambling, for instance. And so you can have these periods that alternate with severe depression, difficult to treat. And this is particularly difficult to treat because you're treating two different things. Treating depression takes one type of thing, and treating mania takes another, and it can be difficult to treat. And then when you look at people's behavior, it can be quite difficult to understand, right? There's the classic case, and we'll look at now the next major thing, which is schizophrenia, which may actually kind of go again, not be part of the continuity thing. This might be a discontinuity where there's something fundamentally different about how people with schizophrenia are thinking and acting. And there was a classic case. There's an actress named Amanda Bynes who, and again, I'm not saying she's schizophrenic. She kind of was, she was extremely popular actress, a child actress, and then as a young adult, a lot of movies. And then we started to see some issues with drugs and alcohol, odd behavior, like shaving her head, piercing her cheeks, sending kind of hostile notes to other celebrities, claiming she invented ILY and LOL. And she claimed that there was molestation from her father, odd behavior, a microchip in her brain. These things appear to be very odd, delusional type thinking, but that doesn't mean it's schizophrenia. That can be related to drug use, right? And when we consider the case of Amanda Bynes, we're considering kind of like you have to rule out a whole bunch of different things. And in her case, more recently, evidence has been coming out that young actresses like herself, young actors and actresses, have been abused, and were often abused by people in the industry of Hollywood or the shows and things they were on. And we already saw that childhood abuse, physical sexual abuse can lead to severe issues as adults, and can influence schizophrenia, but also other things, drug use, mental health issues, and just dealing with trauma, like dealing with severe trauma. And oftentimes people with resources, it's they're not crazy, they're eccentric, that's just how they are. People kind of tell them their behavior is okay. Like you've seen certain celebrities that are just acting in ways that we are like, that is horrible, but they're surrounded by people who are like, oh, you're famous, you're wonderful, and so they kind of get that support. Like, there's a famous singer who abuses women, and a lot of women support him because he's attractive, and this is mind-boggling. So when we look at schizophrenia, we want to go back and say, what are these cases? And having worked with people with schizophrenia and other types of psychotic disorders, you can really see these changes, these odd thinking, where the conversation might make sense and then it doesn't. Characteristics include delusions and hallucinations. Delusions are beliefs that are far outside the realm of reality, like a delusion of power or fame or persecution. Hallucinations, hearing voices and seeing things that aren't there. Disorganized thinking, emotions, and behavior, right? So things that don't quite line up or make sense. And reduced enjoyment and interest. There's a number of factors. You have both what are called positive and negative symptoms. And patients with positive symptoms, these positive symptoms are things like delusions and hallucinations. And the negative symptoms are like reduced enjoyment and interest, what we call flat affect, which is, someone gives you a present and you're just like, thanks. There's no emotional response that would be typical. Causes seem to be both, again, diathesis stress, genetic and environmental. In fact, schizophrenia may be a cluster of diseases where different genes are involved in different symptoms, and clearly different treatments are necessary because, again, we're talking about a wide range of symptoms and behaviors. In this case, pregnancy complications could cause abnormal brain development, childhood head injuries and viral infections of the brain, and living in families with high discord. High discord is, during childhood, can very much lead to mental health issues. You see certain things happening, which is brain abnormalities. And it's not clear why this is, if it's, causing the schizophrenia or affected by the schizophrenia, how progressive it is. It seems, though, that there's certain hypotheses for it, and it's possible that overstimulation of certain brain areas can lead to degradation over time. And you see this kind of like, atrophy in certain areas over time. It tends to develop after age 20, but can show signs earlier. A lot of younger, teenagers who may show some signs of, kind of pre-schizophrenia, most of them don't develop schizophrenia. You end up with deficits in attention, memory, and impulse control. It's kind of seen at that time because that's when the prefrontal cortex is supposed to really develop, and it doesn't. It matures slowly. So at the earlier ages, it isn't quite involved, but then at adulthood, it really has issues, and you can see this loss of gray matter over time, this loss. So it's not developing, and it's also regressing in a certain regard. But just like anything else, culture influences how we deal with things. In Ireland, a lot of people believe that they're saints. This is also true in places like Jerusalem, where you have, a massive amount of religious history, right? And so very religious people might believe that they are messianic figures, the reincarnations of saints or prophets, and being in that area can actually kind of kick off an episode for people. In the US, there's this high paranoia, right? Because, well, and not just the US, but other industrialized areas, we're all being watched. You know what I mean? There's your cameras on, your phone's got multiple cameras, there's CCTV everywhere. And so the idea of being spied on isn't outside the realm of logic, but it's taken to an extreme where it is actually called, a number of patients were admitted to a major psychiatric hospital in New York, Bellevue. And out of this came what's called the Truman Show effect, where these patients all had very similar symptoms that seemed kind of like the Truman Show, which was a movie where the main character was literally being watched like from birth, as like the most popular TV show in the world. It was this huge, huge, thing, and everyone's watching, and people had delusions that were related to this. Like, oh, I'm going to get a big award. I'm on TV, so they start acting like they're on TV, like everything's over dramatized, as part of this delusion. In places like Japan, where honor and social conformity are important, people have fear of slander and being humiliated, very severe in the schizophrenia. And then you get places like Nigeria, where people still believe that mental illness is caused by evil spirits. And delusions may take on the form of witches or ancestral ghosts. And in places like that, it's not that big of a deal, right? How we deal with these things. I mean, schizophrenia is seen as extremely debilitating in our culture, but in other places, someone who has these symptoms might be seen as, being blessed by the gods or being communicated to by the gods. In India, some African cultures, some American cultures, you can actually see where these influences are, well, we believe that this could be a connection with the other world, the other world. Therefore, the people are treated much more carefully and sometimes very respectfully. Sometimes they're like, oh, you're a shaman, you're a priest, awesome. And these symptoms. In these areas, the schizophrenic symptoms are not as debilitating. People can often still function, right? The voices that people hear are often not that bad. The Western voices, the industrial, very negative, right? But in cultures that don't see it so negatively, not so much. We can see this influence, this cultural influence on mental illness. And only when we as a culture develop a stronger support and stronger understanding of mental illness will we really be able to treat and support people as they go through these, for most people, typical experiences throughout their lives. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our discussion on disorders and the kind of direction we've taken with it, and I look forward to future discussions with you. Thank you.